She was lawyers.
I grew up with a lawyer, I don't need to learn about lawyers.
Your daddy was a lawyer, you married one, and what a sad, what a record. Thank you, sir.
Well, I married one too.
You're all set.
Oh,
You know, my father was a criminal attorney here in Mobile.
Really?
Okay.
So you've lived here all your life?
Mostly, you know, I lived in Houston for a couple of years, and lived up in Grove Hill, which is 2 counties up in Sargent County for a couple of years.
But basically
I was
here.
born in Mobile for
Really? Wow.
She was born under the Azalea bush.
my birth certificate says address of my mother, Spring Hill.
No, they haven't asked me, so.
That's
But
unbelievable.
yeah, I need to
Yeah.
real quick.
Okay, go.
I can probably get a grave site in the Spring Hill Cemetery.
There you go. Do you have a next one for me?
You're gonna spread me, I'm not getting, I'm getting cremated, thank you, Jesus. No offense, just say that from the rabbi, thank you, God. Hey.
You say that in Hebrew, Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem, like it sounds
Blessed be God.
blessed. Baruch, I knew it was blessed. Baruch Hashem, remember that.
Baruch Hashem.
It's like
Hashem is literally the name.
the name.
Oh,
Because the name is so holy, we don't say it.
right.
So it's the name. So
I like
Baruch Hashem is,
And Baruch
blessed
is
be the
blessed.
name. Yeah.
I like L'chaim,
Yeah, me too.
Life.
the life, L'chaim. It's one of my favorite Hebrew things. Every day is.
2025, Happy New Year.
Yes. What's the Jewish New Year?
The Jewish New Year?
Yeah, Jewish
We
Year.
have 4 of them.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought it was just 2.
The Jewish, how long, we talking 5,000?
We're in 50,
57, 80,
57.
85?
86.
No, it's 85.
85.
Yeah,
Is
57.
this the right one? It starts with Genesis?
What's that?
Is this the right one? It starts with Genesis?
That's just a handout of text that we might refer
Oh,
to
that just not Shabbat, okay.
as we go through. Okay,
Ready?
so why don't we get started? We'll have a little bit of a shortened class today, a shortened presentation because of the film festival. It starts at 2, very interesting film about a middle-aged man, about 50, and he's born in Casablanca, raised in a Sephardic household. The family moves to France, and he had an experience as a young boy where he was in awe of Catholicism, went into a church and found it to be awe-inspiring, and now we find him now back at home, and he's about to convert to Catholicism. So he's Jewish, and parents don't know, but then the parents find out, and it's all about that interaction between them. So that's the film. I've watched about half of it thus far, and it's interesting. It's not about, it doesn't have much to do with American culture and American assimilation, but it certainly is interesting. And
It's in French, isn't it?
yeah, so we'll see.
It's in French?
What's that?
Yes.
It's French with subtitles. Yeah. So it's kind of worth sticking around for if you're interested. That's not okay. So it seems as if from the last time that we covered Orthodox, conservative, and Reform perspectives about the Shabbat, and let's just review a little bit where that comes from. Just in terms of theory, and then if we finish up, I'd like us to take a look at the Mishnah for Shabbat, which is on page 2 and 3. We just kind of work through that text, and then we'll move on, if we have time, to Rosh Hashanah. So Orthodoxy is based on the idea that the two Torahs were given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. We're going back to I think the second lecture, what is Torah? We talked about God in the first lecture. In the second one, we talked about the Torah. And in Orthodox Judaism, there are two Torahs that are given. One is the written law, what we have in here, and the other is the oral law, which eventually becomes redacted into something called the Mishnah, which is we have that here, which we'll take a look at, that tells us the details that are absent. And the belief in Orthodox Judaism is that this oral law is was handed down from Moses to the elders all the way to about 220 CE, when it was written down, an edited version by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. This is very important because, again, we're going to tie this back to Orthodox practice. Okay? So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his colleagues at Usha did their best to edit this document. So by its own admission, okay, it's not perfect. It's not a catechism. Even in the Mishnah, which is the redacted version of the oral law, not the commentary to it, not the analysis of it, that takes place later on between 350 all the way, some say 600 to 700 in the two Talmuds. One is the Yerushalmi Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, and the other one is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay? So when we talk about the Mishnah, we are talking about an edited version of a section, really, of this oral law. One can argue that the oral law includes includes Midrash. There are other texts besides Midrash. There's, what's it called? Midrash. There's also something called the Tosefta, which is a very interesting document, very interesting text that we have a written version of, called additional, stuff that was left out by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his colleagues, that gets picked up and put into another book that in some ways complements, in some ways is at odds with the Mishnah, but is picked up anyway. All of that is really the entire law, but for our purposes and for halachic purposes, for Jewish legal purposes, practice purposes, the Mishnah is really the main center of attention. Is so far so good? Okay. So the Mishnah helps us understand the written law, and we've talked about this previously, because the Torah itself is incomplete because it just states certain things. So for example, you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. What is this thing that they're supposed to bind upon their hand, and what is this thing that they're supposed to keep on their heads? Well, to understand that, we have to go to the Mishnah, and then following that, we need a discussion in the Talmud to figure out what exactly those things are, and those are the phylacteries that Orthodox men put on. But when they do that, they believe that they are fulfilling the will of God through the Torah. And they believe the Torah at the core was divinely given by God to Moses. And if you're Orthodox and you believe that system, then you're going to follow, unless well, I'm Orthodox, I believe on all that, but I can't follow it. I'm not, for whatever the reason, I'm not strong enough, I'm not disciplined enough. I like to ride in my car, but I still consider myself to be Orthodox. Yes?
Does the Mishnah talk about the content of the phylacteries and all of that?
The content of...
The content that they put in the phylactery.
Oh, yes, yeah. The Mishnah and of course the Talmud. You also have to understand that when the Mishnah is being written, it's there's three. We're getting a little bit off topic. There's other rabbis who can disagree with what's written in the Mishnah. Okay, and their opinions, if you think of it as a big film, okay, and the film needs to get edited, right? So there's stuff that's falling on the floor. In the Tannaitic period, rabbis could disagree with the Mishnah. They could hold contrary views. It wasn't beyond them to do that. And they had permission because they were part of this redactive process into the Mishnah. So pretend that dissenting opinions and other things got dropped on the floor in the editing process. Okay? These things get picked up in another period that's called the Amoraic period, which is about from 250 to about 425, or 350 even. And these are called Brightot, or Brises, Orthodox. These are, and you can distinguish them in the Talmud. There's a word that's always used to indicate that what they're citing now is a different opinion from that of the Mishnah, and how can the views be reconciled? That's kind of the mission of the Talmud, to be honest, okay? Or one of the major things of the Talmud. So in Orthodox Judaism, as it relates to the Sabbath, they base, they have to define what is work. Or what does it mean to observe, and what does it mean to keep? What does it mean to remember? And that sets up a whole series of, how do you say, conversations. And at the heart of Orthodox practice of the Shabbat is the Vishamru, which is in our liturgy, right? Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et Shabbat l'dorotam b'rit olam. Because that is placed right before the description of how to build a tabernacle. So in Rabbinic Judaism, they'll say the Torah just wasn't put together in a slipshod manner. There's reasons why things are placed where they're placed. So why is this Vishamru, to keep the children of Israel commanded to keep the Sabbath for all generations? Why are they commanded to do that? Why is it placed? Why did God place that right before the instructions of building the tabernacle? To teach us, this is their interpretation, based on what's called hekesh, juxtaposition. Okay, they first seem unrelated. If you read the Vishamru, that you shall keep the Sabbath for all generations, a sign between it, doesn't have anything to do with building the temple. Why does it appear right before? Why? So there has to be a hekesh, there has to be a connection. So the sages deduce that the reason for that is that even when it comes to building the tabernacle, you cannot work on Shabbat to build the tabernacle. It's a reminder that before you get to building the tabernacle, you cannot do the work of the tabernacle, even though it's a house of God, even though it's going to be a place where people can pray, even though it's going to be a place where God dwells. You cannot work on the Sabbath relative to building the tabernacle. So, what do they draw from that? What they draw from that is, okay, so that has to be the thing that constitutes work. All the stuff that went into building the tabernacle, that constitutes work. And so they set up, categories of what constitutes labor. And I've used this example many times. If I take that instrument, okay, and I push it from here down to the end of the hall, and I work up a big sweat, that's not work, okay? But if I take this prayer book and I take it outside, in Orthodox Judaism, that's considered labor. Now, I shouldn't be moving a musical instrument on the Sabbath, but the question that the rabbis look at, and this is where you get into problems of Jewish spirituality, they're not looking at it in terms of it's going to affect the spirituality of the Sabbath. They're looking at it from the standpoint, have you violated the Sabbath by doing work? Because if you have, then there are what I'll call theoretical punishments. There are punishments for violating the Sabbath. And much of what Jewish tradition is about in the Talmud in these texts is about whether there is a violation of the commandment. So everybody follow that? Okay. So they created 30, not created, but they discerned that with regards to the tabernacle, they discerned 40 minus 1, we'll read the Mishnah, 40 minus 1, 39 different categories of what constitutes work. And that's how you define whether or not there is work, yes.
Why would pushing that instrument down the hall not be work?
Because I'm not taking it from a private domain into a public domain. I'm in a private domain, okay? Now, in a walled city, I could. Like in Old Jerusalem, you can carry. There is, so in Jerusalem and in a walled city, like a fortress, you can carry, as long as it's enclosed. We're getting a little bit off topic, but Orthodox practice of Shabbat is really interesting. They created, or they didn't create, a legal fiction to make a walled city. For example, parts of New York are a walled city. Even though there's not a wall up that resembles anything like Old Jerusalem. And that, what they do is they string a wire along the various electrical poles, right? They string a wire, and the wire has to wrap around, has to be enclosed, has to be like in a complete walled and that area is called an eruv, or what the wires are called or a string. You can use a string, but usually they'll use a wire. The reason they use a wire is because they don't want the eruv to come down. In Orthodox communities that have an eruv, that have this artificial thing to allow people to walk, before Shabbat, they will put down where if the eruv has fallen. People will go out and check to make sure that the eruv is up. There are people that will go around and they will look to make sure that the eruv, and if the eruv is down, they will send out a text or whatever, or they'll put on their website that the eruv is down, or if it's really big and it's only down in one section, but it still constitutes the halachic requirement of an eruv, they'll say the eruv is down between 32nd Street and 35th Street, and that area you got to be careful about, something like that. So, I mean, it's a whole, but when they say that Judaism has a legalistic component to it, that's a really great example. And where does that come from? That comes from the Mishnah. There's a collection of Mishnayot that's called Eruvim, and then there's a whole Talmud that on the subject of these eruvs. Now, before I get into that, I want to be clear when I say there's a whole Talmud on it. Every single Talmud, okay, gets off the subject. Okay, it's not like in law books, right? It's not where, okay, we're going to talk about judges and we're going to talk about this and that's what we're going to talk about. It's a lot of associative type topics. It's more of an anthology of Jewish tradition. It's more of an anthology of Jewish practice, Jewish folklore. It's not more than that, but they'll get off the topic every few pages. If they've got into an intense discussion about what constitutes an eruv, there's going to be a break somewhere, and they're going to talk about King David and what he did to Uriah. They're going to get off the topic, and they're going to go to some other that's related, but it's very tangential, and you know that they're not talking about the eruv at this point. Yeah.
The U.S. Code and then the Code of Federal Regulations kind of when you were talking reminds me of that, because it gets very circular at times and way out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so far from what you're talking about in our legalistic community.
Sure. I completely. That's why I liked Article 9 of the of the commercial code.
Yeah.
That was the only course in law school that I got an A in. The only, well, no, I got a couple more A's, but I was a very average law student. But I was proud to be in law school, it didn't bother me, but I really, because not everybody can go to law school and not everybody graduates from law and all of that. So, and I love the study of law. But Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code, it's just, once you get into it and you read it, it's very logical. And 99.9% of the time, if you get a question, it involves a bank, the bank's going to win. So there's a beautiful logic to it. I mean, really, of course, there's not a big need for it anymore because of with the electronic transfers and all of that, and PayPal and so
I
forth.
made an A in antitrust and I never used it.
Oh, no, I love that course. So let's look at the very last Mishnah, Shabbat 7:1. Okay, and it picks up this fundamental Mishnah. That's my addition, but really starts with one who sells. I forget how it's introduced. Okay. I know what I did here. There is, at some point in our discussion, what we should do is, you should all bring a laptop one day, and I'll show you how to use a wonderful resource. It's called Safaria. It's a online digital library of all texts that you would ever want to go through in your lifetime. So, here, this is taken from Mishnahs, and the reason why it says this fundamental Mishnah enumerates those who perform the primary categories of labor prohibited on Shabbat, which number 40 less 1. Okay? So that's the commentary by Adin Steinsaltz, who was really probably the foremost scholar in our lifetime. He's no longer alive, really wonderful human being. Okay, so who would like to read, beginning with they are grouped in accordance with their function? Anybody want to read?
It's on the
Okay,
third line.
if you look on page 2.
It's on the third line.
I'll go ahead and read.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. They are grouped in accordance.
One who sows,
Mhm.
and one who plows, and one who reaps, and one who gathers sheaves into a pile, and one who threshes, removing the kernel from the husk, and one who winnows thresh grain in the wind, and one who selects the inedible waste from the edible, and one who grinds, and one who sifts flour in a sieve, and one who kneads dough, and one who bakes. Additional primary categories of prohibited labor are the following: one who shears wool, and one who whitens it, and one who combs the fleece and straightens it, and one who dyes it, and one who spins the wool, and one who stretches the threads of the warp in the loom, and one who constructs meshes, tying the threads of the warp to the base of the loom, and one who weaves 2 threads, and one who severs 2 threads for constructive purposes, and one who ties a knot, and one who unties a knot, and one who sews 2 stitches with a needle, as well as one who tears a fabric in order to sew 2 stitches. And one who traps a deer or any living creature, and one who slaughters it, and one who flays it, and one who salts its hide, a step in the tanning process, and one who tans its hide, and one who smooths it, removing hairs and veins, and one who cuts it into measured parts. One who writes 2 letters, and one who erases it in order to write 2 letters. One who builds a structure, and one who dismantles it. One who extinguishes a fire, and one who kindles a fire. One who strikes a blow with a hammer to complete the production of process of a vessel. Rabban, say, I can't remember that one. Rabban Hanel.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's just, he's someone who comments on the side of the,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Right, and one who carries of an object from domain to domain. All these are primary categories of labor, and they number 40 less 1.
Okay.
Why
So,
don't they say
though-
40 less 1? Why don't they just say 39?
For that, we have to read the Gemara, we have to read the Talmud, because the
Oh
Talmud
my
will,
God.
Was that, which Gemara was it?
this would be in Shabbat,
Okay, what I mean, was it from Babylonian or?
Babylonian, yeah.
Babylonian?
So you'd see this Mishnah there, and then if you wanted to figure out, well, why does it say 40 less 1, the Gemara, the Talmud, the discussion of this Mishnah will oftentimes talk about the structure and will challenge the actual structure of the Mishnah. So in the what's called the Mishnah that's in Brachot, which is blessings, they'll the first thing they talk about is from what time in the evening to what time in the evening can you recite the Shema Yisrael? Because you're supposed to recite it twice a day, in the evening and in the morning. And they will talk about, for example, why do they begin? Why should this Mishnah begin with the recitation of the Shema in the evening? Let it start in the morning. And then they cite a principle later on. And so the answer to that, they go back and forth. The answer to that is why? Because it says, "Uvishochbacha uvikumecha," when you lie down and when you rise up. So the author of the Mishnah is stating the case of the evening first to follow the scriptural passage. Okay? And then it goes on and on a little bit after that, and then talks about, that gets challenged, and then they say, well, the reason it starts off in the evening is because it's letting us know when day begins. Why? Because in Judaism, the day begins in the evening. Why does it begin in the evening? Vayihi era, vayihi voker, yom echad. That's the first phrase of the Bible. There was evening and there was morning one day. So since the scripture says evening first, therefore the Tana, to be consistent with scripture, began the Mishnah that way.
And that's why our Shabbat starts on Friday night
Right.
instead of Saturday
Yeah,
morning.
because the Jewish day begins in the evening. Why? Because the Bible says there was evening, there was morning one day. Right?
But my question has always been to God, why did you start it in the evening?
Well, the better question is that God asked, well, why do you think the day would begin in the morning? Just because you wake up. Well, actually the day begins at midnight, right?
Yes.
Which makes no sense because it's completely dark. Right. Look, for me too. I mean,
Military
Yeah.
time starts at midnight.
Yeah, that raises questions. But you can see the detail here that's absent. What does it mean to observe? What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to keep? This is what it means. These are the things you cannot do because you would not be keeping or safeguarding the Shabbat. These are the categories of work that relate to the construction of the tabernacle. Yes?
So to modernize this, I could not brush my dog. Is that correct?
That seems to be correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless she was inside?
No.
No,
And
because
on
it says
Shabbat,
here that you
there's-
shouldn't,
it's
well, hold
very
on a second.
specific about the wool and
That's true.
all of that. So
Yeah.
they modernize these
No,
things.
I don't know, hold on, when who combs the fleece and
Look
trick?
at the wool
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
brushing of it. I think that they would modernize it that I couldn't brush my dog.
so I'm
On
gonna
Shabbat.
get Talmudic with you for that.
Okay, well, that's what your PhD
What
is,
they're
that's what you do
talking
it.
about in sheep and so forth and taking care of the sheep, that's for commercial purposes.
So it wouldn't pertain
Well, I
to-
don't know, I'd have to look it
Yeah.
up. So I'd have to look it up.
See why I love him so much?
I know, people
It's
think, well,
interesting though.
but if you
because-
believe that God wants you to do this, then you're gonna figure out what you can do and what you cannot do.
Well, I just know because I lived among the Orthodox
And they said you
spot.
couldn't?
No, and like you can't water a plant. You
Right.
cannot water a plant. I was shocked at that.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so where in here do we find something about plant watering?
Well, you do. You
know.
see it here. One who sows and one who plows, one who reaps, and all of that. You
Yeah.
cannot do work that constitutes.
But-
Now, there's exceptions to that. You get
Right.
more and more detail,
Right,
but it flows from that.
it flows from it.
Yeah, there are some issues about, what if it's a famine, what if the plant needs the water and there's a drought and all of that.
Right,
There are exceptions, but on its own, if you water your plants before Shabbat,
right,
you
exactly.
prepare before. You
Right.
comb your dog in the afternoon, on Friday afternoon.
Right,
You don't comb your hair, you don't comb the hair of the animal on Shabbat. I think they were just, they left already, that's fine, yeah. Yes.
The wind?
No, that's fine. But then if you're talking about, and on the seventh day, God rested, and
Mhm.
take it very, 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 the
Right.
conservative Orthodox take it very seriously.
That's why I always
Right,
wondered
well,
about the evening and the
yeah, see,
morning.
but that phrase isn't right there, that's a good, see, now, probably in the Talmud Shabbat or somewhere, and I don't quite know where the locus of this teaching is, but, I think it's Midrashic, but it also could be, because Talmud has Midrash in it, don't get me, there's a lot of Midrash in it. There, that's the question, the Talmud, what is it, that God got tired? Did God get tired and therefore needed to rest? No. The reason why that is there is to teach us how to, our need for rest. That if God needs rest, so to speak, quote, then how much the more so are we in need of rest, and rest that has to be blessed and sanctified. So how do you bless the Shabbat? Well, you light candles. Now this goes back. This is in this midrash, which maybe is fourth, maybe fifth, in terms of when can we say with confidence that midrash was written down? Probably around the 5th century. So it's very old. I mean, if you consider that midrash is a teaching from God, that lighting candles was done very early on, and they did it as an Orthodox practice, then God lit candles on Shabbat. Not that God needed to lit. There's an anthropomorphism here, of course, but to teach us that lighting candles is the way we bless the Shabbat.
Observe,
And how do we
remember.
sanctify it? We sanctify it when we make the kiddush, when we say the blessing over the wine, and Mekadesh HaShabbat, we sanctify the day. We render it holy. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir?
Okay, that's more theological and philosophical, whereas this is what we would call halacha. This is what we call more Jewish law. What you are prohibited from doing, right? So lighting a fire, the use of electricity, you can't use electricity on the Shabbat. So how do you get around that? You have timers, okay? Or you have,
Make sure you turn your heat on before
or
Shabbat.
you leave your stove on in a very low temperature, and you begin cooking the food because you need a hot meal on Shabbat. On a day like this, you need a hot meal. So what is Shabbat? Like yesterday. So what Orthodox people will do is they will start cooking what's called chod. It's a very, if you're
It's a
cold,
stew.
it's like a stew, but it's got all kinds of potatoes and
It's so
beef.
heavy, you cannot believe how heavy it is.
It is,
Turnips, carrots.
it is
it's,
heavier in
It's-
your stomach than if you would eat that chair. That's how
like
heavy it
lead.
is.
Yeah, it's
But-
heavy.
But if you've ever been
Kept
to
you
Eastern
warm.
Europe where this dish originated, you know what a great thing. Now, what they needed was to keep it, to have hot, right? Because if you've ever been to Eastern Europe, which I think you have, right?
No, I have not.
Oh, it gets cold. It gets kind of like this, only about 20 degrees, maybe
Colder
10 degrees
and wet.
and wet and damp, and it's horrible. I mean, it's just really bad. That's my experience. Okay, so what they do, and they do this to this very day, Orthodox Jews do this every day, they start cooking the food at a very low temperature, before the Shabbat begins. Since it's already cooking, you've already lit the fire, let it go. And they have something that's called...
They also have a plate.
Yeah, right. It's called a blach, I think it's called.
It's a blach.
A
Yeah.
blach, right? And the blach is, it's like a hot plate, so to speak.
Exactly.
And then
Except
they
it's
put
real low
the-
temp.
And then, very low temp, and they put the food on top of
So
that.
once
and
they
it
cook
cooks.
the food and it's hot, they
Yeah.
put it on the blech just to keep it warm.
Right.
Yeah,
There's a division then, if you're looking at this, and I'm trying to take it into mind, between the holy and the practical.
Exactly.
between what? I'm sorry.
The holy and the practical.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the funniest story, I've told you this story, was I lived above a family that was very Orthodox, and they were wonderful people. It's not quite like today, but I mean, they were just really sweet, 4 generations, and they were St. Louis Cardinal fans. They loved the St. Louis Cardinal fans, right? And they, Saturday afternoon,
Magical.
so they had a timer on the TV, and the TV would go on at about the time the baseball game would come on. They weren't using the electricity. I mean, they weren't starting the fire. The timer was doing that. There's,
That's a little pushing it.
Yeah, it's a stretch.
yeah, but they,
But they do it, and they do it in spot, which is about as Orthodox as you get.
they have timers.
timers for, not TV.
Yeah, they
I
wouldn't use
never
TV.
saw a TV in an Orthodox home, anywhere in spot. But they would use timers for everything else, for the lights and just about anything else they would
Yeah.
use it for.
Yeah. And so you get this balance between a heavy emphasis on legalism, and the spirituality is kind of, I won't say taken for granted, but it's the concern is the violation of the Shabbat, not the spirituality of it. That is kind of assumed. That is assumed by the way the Friday night meal, going to shul. What they're behaviorists. I'll put it that way. They are behavior. It's behavior that matters.
Is it lest we offend the Almighty, Yahweh?
No,
No, they're commandments.
It's a commandment, and
It's a
because
commandment, okay.
you've accepted, because when you recite the Shema, you're accepting the yoke of heaven.
Yeah.
In Judaism, the relationship between God and the human being, the Jewish person, is to accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, not an exactly flattering relationship, but and once you accept that, you accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, then you're going to accept and follow the commandments. Now, I just got through reading, I'm trying to do what's called, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I began to, once again, try to do what's called a daf yomi. A daf yomi is a page of Talmud every day. You say, well, that doesn't sound so bad.
Oh.
It's both sides. First of all, it's both sides of the
How
page.
long does it take? Tell
It
them.
takes 7 years. If you do it every day, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shabbat, if you do it every day, you will finish it in 7 years. So one of the
Crazy.
so I just picked it up where there was it's not an organization, but everybody who's in the Daf Yomi, they can start at any time and any place, but everybody's studying the same thing. So the world who's involved in this is looking at Sanhedrin, which is about judges in courts, which is a good place for me to start. And I've been doing it now for almost a month, I
At
think.
least, yeah.
Yeah, I'm 5 pages behind. I'm 5 pages behind already. They're there, and I, for one reason or another, I didn't do it. And I fell behind them. So now I got to do 2 a day, and I got to squeeze it in. But in the Talmud side, just got through talking about this, is that but why doesn't the Torah give a lot of reasons for the commandments that are given? So, for example, they're talking about kings, Okay, and you can translate kings into presidents if you'd like.
Yeah.
You know, not translate, but, you know, they're talking about rulers.
Pharaoh.
And they're talking about, in Deuteronomy, it says you shouldn't have too many wives, you shouldn't have too much money, you shouldn't have too much property. That's in
Not too many
Deuteronomy about a king.
horses.
And a king should write a Torah. So they get into this discussion about, you know, why doesn't it give the rationale for that commandment? And for many other commandments, it doesn't give us the reason for it. Like, for example, say kashrut or putting on tefillin and so forth. There's not, a lot of times there aren't reasons. And the reason they don't do that is this idea that if you gave reasons for the various commandments, people would find ways to get around and say, well, the rationale for that law doesn't really apply to me. So therefore, I can go ahead and violate the commandment because the rationale. So therefore, the Torah is very limited in terms of when it explains, you know, to do a specific commandment.
I never knew this.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's, well, I mean, that's just what the Gemara will talk
It's
about.
really
So,
interesting.
so there's about Sanhedrin, about judges, so sometimes it gets off. I mean, that's a good example,
We
okay?
are good at justifying ourselves.
Well, the example they use is Solomon, right? Right, Solomon, because Solomon had,
A lot of wives.
yeah, you're not supposed to have so many wives. Though, in that section, they talk about what constitutes too many wives for a king, and I think it's 18. So,
He
I mean,
also
for what
wasn't
that's worth.
supposed to marry outside of his faith. And the
Right.
very first wife he took was a wife from Egypt.
Exactly.
also-
That's what got
That
us trouble.
was, exactly, that was
And
his,
that got him in trouble in his old age.
right, exactly, yeah.
And it also took on foreign religions.
That's what,
Well-
that's why he took on foreign religions,
Yeah.
was satisfying
It's
his
really
wants.
more about, in my own little
I'm the
notes,
woman.
because we're getting a little bit off the topic, and that's my fault. What I think that section, in terms of how it might apply for us today, if you think about our obsession, I'm talking about society, obsession with sexuality, that is sort of the, I don't want to say it's not the ultimate, but that is, we're a highly sexualized society. And that is what I think some of these things involving the ruler is supposed to not get himself involved in, because it prevents, now I'm getting Freudian, it prevents sublimation. There's no question the human instinct is driven towards sexuality, towards sexual expression. There's no question about that. But Freud, who happened to be Jewish, says that sublimation has to take place for society to function. That cannot run wild. Desires cannot be. Really what you want to do is take that desire and channel it into good works, works that benefit society, works that benefit the individual, works that benefit society. And I think there's some truth to that when you go back and you really examine what it is that they're talking about. The king as being the personification of one who has a lot of power. What they're saying is too much of anything for the king is bad. And that he is to write, in Deuteronomy, a Torah and keep that, to have two Torahs, one that he keeps in his house and one that travels with him all the time to remind him of how to act halachically, how to act properly. But I'm getting a little bit far afield.
Well, God calls us to self-control.
I want to get back to the Shabbat. What's that?
God calls us to self-control.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's, I think, if we have one downfall as a society, and not only the downfall, I'm making a comment, but is that our, we're not as religiocentric in a good way as I think we could do better. I think as a society, given the riches that we have as a country, given the wealth that we have, I think we could do better than what we're doing, and particularly the trends that are going on. And I
Well,
see.
even too, the violence. I mean, we went to see a movie and we saw
Yeah.
previews that were horrifying. I mean, literally horrifying. I couldn't look. And and they were all violent. And I thought, it's just, society
wasn't a
doesn't need that.
Right.
Children don't need to see those things.
Yeah, I mean, but that's what's, like superpower and all of that, it's not bad, but there's so much of it. There's so, I mean, we
It was the
went to
violence.
see A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan movie.
Maybe it's they don't show too many of those in Ukraine.
What's that?
Maybe they don't show too many of those in Ukraine,
Probably not.
because and Israel,
Well, they're living, they're living.
living it.
they're living the violence.
It's terrible.
Well said.
Okay, so, now, I've given sort of the orthodox view of how the Sabbath translates into practice and why it's translated that way. If you look at conservative view, the conservative view is in the middle. Because there is this halachic tradition, picture conservative Judaism as kind of being like tavya, in a way. They're going to keep the tradition alive regardless of whether they believe the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. They say, come, but we also know that there's changing circumstances, and as long as we work within a halachic framework, okay, then we aren't necessarily bound by that there are ways for us to get around the halacha and still be halachic at the same time. And the best historical example I can think of is the permissibility of driving to the synagogue on Shabbat. The rabbis in the rabbinical assembly took it upon themselves to issue what's called a takana. Because why? Because Jews were living very far, Jews weren't living close to the synagogue anymore in the 50s. They were moving into suburbs, and they lived far away. It wasn't walkable. And second generation, the kids who grew up in Orthodox homes, they weren't so Orthodox. Right? They wanted to be more integrated into society, so to speak. And they didn't see the reason why you can't drive, but they wanted to come to synagogue, so they needed, they said, well, rabbis have the authority to actually modify halakha where there are exigent circumstances, so we have that authority to do that, and therefore we can create some exception to established rules. The reason you can't drive a car on Shabbat is you're burning gasoline, right? You turn the key and the ignition and spark plug, electricity, and then the engine starts, and then you're burning gasoline. That is just, there's no question that driving a car under the framework of the Mishnah is strictly forbidden. But they made an exception. They made an exception for the greater sake of the Jewish communities.
But it's just a synagogue, it's nowhere else.
But they did it within a halachic framework. They did it within the system, or they claim to do it within the system that they have. So they wrote responsive. They wrote opinions about how they could justify allowing their congregants to drive on Shabbat within the Jewish legal framework of the Talmud. They found support for this within the Talmud. Okay? All right. What about Reform? How does it work in Reform? Well, Reform takes a very different attitude. First, Reform says, well, it's true that you're free to believe whatever, within the framework of Torah, to believe whatever you want to believe and so forth. The vast majority of Reform Jews do not believe that the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. They believe that it is a collection of stories, of customs and traditions that were passed on generation to generation, that perhaps there was some wonderful event that occurred while the children of Israel were in the desert, but it takes on a mythological character as the Torah is being redacted over a long period of time. If you're looking at the Exodus as a historical event, 1250 BCE is not a bad place. Some people date it back to 14, so it's hard to know exactly. And these narratives, much like Indian much like Indian oral traditions, were passed on generation. And as these tribes entered into Israel, there was a need for a kind of constitution, a kind of a document, so to speak, that took all these tribes and showed the history of them becoming a nation. And over time, the Torah was being written, over time, and eventually is considered complete by the time Ezra returns to Israel in about 525 BCE. That's about when the Torah itself is considered to be complete. Okay, so far. Now, some people date it later. Some people date the Torah's completion around 400 to 300 BCE. The generally, it used to, at least when I learned, the generally accepted opinion is 525. My rabbi thought that it was completed by the time of the first exile, and I think that's probably closer to the truth. By the time of the first exile, 586. But what's 75 years when we're talking thousands of years, right? Anyway, so therefore, the Torah, while it's like sort of it defines the Jewish people, it doesn't have the same level of being bound as does in Orthodox and conservative. In liberal Judaism, according to Eugene Borowitz, you study, and you determine what commandments speak to you, that increase your sense of spirituality, your connection to God, and those are the things that you follow. Now, you study, and you see that maybe you shouldn't be driving a car on Shabbat. Well, in Reform Judaism, and say you want to go to the beach. Okay, say you want to go, beautiful, you want to go to Dauphin Island, it's a beautiful Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, and you know that it's Shabbat in tradition, maybe the tradition is you shouldn't drive a car, well, I find I get great spiritual comfort and relaxation and rest if I go to Dauphin Island, and I go to the beach, and I'm with other people, and I feel the wonders of creation. We would say to that person in Reform Judaism, sei gesund, which means go in good health, right? So there is a liberality in Reform Judaism that you don't see in conservative Judaism and you don't see in Orthodox Judaism. Now, there's a joke that if you want to find out where the conservative movement will be in 15 years, just see where the Reform movement is now, and in 15 years the conservative movement will be there. So for a great example is, I guess 1970, I forget the year, in the early 1970s, HUC ordained the first woman rabbi from an established seminary. Okay? About 10 years later, 15 years later, the conservative movement began to ordain women in their, maybe they did, I don't know the exact date, but they did it long after, because women were not considered to be, they weren't going to be rabbis, right? For whatever the reason. But the Reform movement looked at the culture, looked at the women's movement, women's rights movement, and they've always been ahead. The LGBTQ movement that finds full acceptance within Reform Judaism, ignoring, disregarding passages from the Bible regarding wearing the clothes of a member of the opposite sex, lying with a man as one would lie with a woman. And by the way, you can interpret it to mean the ish can be interpreted as being all-inclusive. Though interestingly enough, halachically speaking, lesbianism is not biblically prohibited. It's true. It is an ordinance by the rabbis because of the word ish. They interpret it as a man.
Not isha.
Because it's considered a toiv, an abomination. They're going to interpret that statute very narrowly, because it involves real punishment. I mean, I think death, if I'm not mistaken, from a biblical standpoint, okay? And so what about women? So the reason why lesbianism is prohibited isn't because of that. It's because they will be inclined not to perform the mitzvah of Peru or Vu. In Judaism, being fruitful and being multiplying is one of the first commandments in the Bible. In fact, you can divorce if your spouse is sterile on either side. No, I don't know about on either side, but certainly a man, if the woman cannot have babies, the husband has a right to divorce because they can't fulfill the mitzvah of Peru. I mean, that's a mitzvah, and divorce is permitted. So the fear was that women would not want to procreate, or men wouldn't have women to procreate. Whatever you want.
We get it.
Yeah, okay, you get it. Good, thank you. Help me out of the hole.
You can stop now.
Help me out of the hole that I've dug for myself. Okay. And so the LGBTQ movement was accepted. They didn't care. They said, "What's fair? What is just? You know, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? What does it mean to accept and love another human being and to embrace?" The prophetic principles dictate, taken out of context, a different result. Reform Judaism is at the heart a prophetic movement. It looks to the prophets for moral guidance. And so, about 10 years later, after all of this, so for example, Reform rabbis will marry a gay couple. Now the conservative movement will marry gay couples.
I didn't know that.
So long as both parties are Jewish. Both parties have to be Jewish. But yeah, the basis for the conservative movement is a very detailed analysis of human sexuality. And working within the framework of what the Talmudists knew and what we know today. And then relying on Maimonides' statement that if there's a conflict between scientific truth and our understanding of the Bible has to conform with demonstrable proof. I mean, scientific, didn't have science. They have science in quite the same way we have science today. In other words, we're not, because we believe fundamentally that the Torah is true with a capital T. If demonstrable proof dictates another result, then it must mean that our understanding of the scripture is wrong. Wow. It's very subtle, very interesting, right? Very interesting. Not everybody agrees with that, by the way, but in the conservative, they will look to stuff like that in the history to make these sort of considerations. And sometimes people are left like this. How can they, how can they do that?
Was this recent? With the same-sex marriage as long as they're both Jewish?
No. It's been for a while. It's been probably since 2000. It's by Elliot Dorff. I can find out the year. I don't know the exact year.
I was just curious because I didn't realize that was okay.
So when it comes to reform and the practice of Shabbat, going out to a nice dinner. For example, many people here, when they had services here, not long ago, they would go out afterwards to a restaurant, right? Yeah, people would go out to a restaurant. Rabbis would join them, right? Get in a car, go out to a restaurant, handle money. The food's going to be prepared. Laws of kashrut.
Forget that.
Though I understand that the original text of the Bible prohibited the eating of shrimp unless you lived in Mobile. I think they amended, for some reason, that didn't continue. I don't know whether they accepted that out, but I think the original, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think there's a passage in there that makes reference to Mobile. We're not. But once again, the reason for that is, those are rituals that don't have meaning. They don't speak to the modern person. We're interested in the prophetic message, and whether we eat shrimp or whether we eat lobster has nothing to do with the development of our soul and our spirituality. And going out amongst friends and community, to go out to a restaurant on Shabbat, that's what's important. That's the way that we celebrate. That's the way that we observe Shabbat. So you can see the difference, the different movements, but yet, and I'll stop with this, the thing that binds all of this together, this mess together, is the Torah. It remains, the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible remains the central document that binds us as a people. We'll stop with that.
Still,
Yeah.
each believer's belief still is a matter of conscience with that believer.
What's that? I'm
I
sorry.
said each believer's belief is still a matter of conscience.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think you're right. It's a matter of conscience. It's also a matter of how you were raised. It also matters in terms of how your spiritual search develops. I mean, I was Orthodox for 4 years. I can't tell you how beautiful it is to observe Shabbat as an Orthodox Jew.
Yep, I agree.
And there are times when I wish I could go back to that.
Me too.
But the whole system wasn't, I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't,
Well, we used to have, as a Christian portion, we used to have Sundays, nobody was open.
Blue sky laws. Yeah.
That's very conservative.
that's right. We need to stop. It's 1:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week we'll go to Rosh Hashanah, we'll go to the High Holy Days.
Now, are we having
No,
it next week because there is no school?
Actually, we're gonna, we're not
that
gonna have
okay
class
weekend?
next week because there's no Sunday school here.
Yeah, okay.
So, but the following week, we will start with Passover, okay? And freedom, okay?
I'm 2 weeks from now.
Right,
Okay.
that will be the
And we need,
night.
we need to get together and swing it.
Well, we'll talk.
He loves to go.
I do too.
He just doesn't get the time.
It's a matter of time for all of us.
Yeah.
Yes, because you couldn't go on Saturday, or could you, since you're reformed?
No, well, I could, but I don't play golf on Shabbat. No, that's not my thing.
You never know when you get a new doorkeeper, might be like,
Yeah. I want to see my husband's family.
okay.
I'm not staying for the movie.
You're not gonna say